In the summer of 1875, a single line in a county burial register recorded something so ordinary it might have been overlooked by anyone, not paying close attention. Infant unnamed, but as the pages turn, that single line repeats again and again until it becomes a chorus of silence. In 1 year alone, more coffins no larger than a bread box were lowered into the soil of Corinth, Mississippi, than in any other county seat in the state. It was a season of mourning so relentless that even the gravediggers whispered of curses. To the people of this town, where children were meant to be a family's legacy and proof of survival after the war, the earth seemed greedy, swallowing futures before they could even draw breath. The records are sober and unembellished, yet the weight behind them is anything but. What should have been the joyous sound of newborn cries often dissolved into weeping, and the citizens were forced to ask themselves whether these deaths were the work of fate or the hand of someone they trusted most. This was a place where faith guided daily life, where a cross hung above nearly every hearth. Yet alongside faith grew suspicion, the sense that an unseen rot had rooted itself in the community. The contrast between what was expected and what came to pass is impossible to ignore. Families prepared cradles and stitched tiny clothes, yet found themselves ordering coffins before the week was out. Women who entered their confinement with hope emerged pale and hollow-eyed, some with empty arms, others not emerging at all. The town learned to avert its eyes from Martha Elkins, the midwife whose steps carried her from bedside to bedside, always arriving at the threshold of birth but leaving behind the shadow of the grave. Before we continue, a necessary note. The events in this account are drawn from documented records, oral histories, and disputed archives. The story you will hear has been reconstructed with care, but it remains part folklore, part official record, and part unanswered question. Some of the descriptions to follow may be difficult to hear, particularly for those who have known the grief of losing a child. Listener discretion is advised. Still, it is precisely because of that grief that this story must be told. The community of Corinth lived through something extraordinary, something they did not know how to name. A century and a half later, we can still trace their unease in the surviving documents and the fragments of testimony. We can still hear their unspoken question. Was Martha Elkins a savior who was tragically misunderstood? Or was she the keeper of every coffin key? Before we turn further into this history, I invite you, wherever you are listening from, to reflect on your own distance from this story. Are you hearing it in a quiet room at night or on a crowded morning train? Drop a note in the comments with your city or country. We are piecing together this history across time and geography, and your perspective matters. This is not merely a tale of one woman or one town. It is a record of how communities interpret suffering, how suspicion can fester in silence, and how the truth can vanish when the soil covers too much too quickly. In 1875, Mississippi, a midwife walked among the living, and coffins followed in her wake. This is where her story begins. Martha Elkins entered the records of Corinth as if she had always been there. No census line marks her arrival. No baptismal entry names her as a child of the town. Instead, she seemed to appear in adulthood, a woman of 30 with practiced hands and an air of weary authority. The families who summoned her spoke of her knowledge, how she could calm a mother's shaking body, how she measured herbs into careful tinctures, how she knew which prayers the elders favored and when to recite them. In a community where doctors were scarce and most lived days' travel away, Martha was indispensable, yet her indispensability was tinged with unease. People said she never smiled when the baby came, only nodded gravely, as though she already knew how quickly joy could sour into grief. Her reputation carried the weight of contradiction. On one side, she was praised as the woman who had attended nearly every birth in Corinth over a decade. Some mothers swore they owed their lives to her quick decisions, in rooms where bleeding threatened to claim them. Others remembered her sharp commands, her insistence that husbands wait outside, her muttered invocations as if she were bargaining with forces unseen. On the other side, there were the coffins. Too many, too frequent. Families whispered in hushed tones, "If Martha comes, be ready to dig a grave." It was not a curse uttered aloud, but a resigned proverb that slid through the community like a draft through a cracked window. Her appearance did not help her cause. Neighbors described her as tall, angular, her face drawn into the shape of severity. She wore black long after mourning was customary, claiming it was for practicality, though some insisted she dressed like a widow before death even arrived. A brass crucifix dangled at her throat, polished from years of touch. Yet she also carried sachets of dried roots and whispered charms in a dialect no one quite recognized. She belonged both to the church and to the fields of older lore, moving between scripture and superstition with unnerving ease. For women in the town, she was a figure of both comfort and terror. Expectant mothers clutched their bellies tighter when she entered the room, torn between the hope that her skills would deliver them safely, and the fear that her very presence invited tragedy. Men distrusted her for other reasons. She was independent, unmarried, and carried knowledge that could humble even the most learned physician. In Reconstruction-era Mississippi, such independence in a woman was nearly scandalous, and in Martha's case, it was interpreted as arrogance. The more she insisted she had been called by God to this work, the more her neighbors whispered that she was guided by something darker. She was tolerated, even respected, because she was necessary. No family could afford to shun her entirely. To do so would mean risking childbirth alone, with nothing but a husband's trembling hands and the prayers of kin. Yet necessity sharpened suspicion. Every time a child was lowered into the earth, the family rehearsed its doubts in private. Did Martha linger too long? Did she press too firmly? Did she say words not meant for human ears? The cycle of reliance and mistrust bound the town to her. Like a bargain, it could neither break nor bear. By the mid-1870s, Martha's name carried weight in Corinth. Some called her Mother Elkins with reverence. Others muttered grave woman when she passed. Children avoided her shadow in the street. But elders tipped their hats, for she still commanded a kind of fearful respect. The paradox defined her existence, healer and harbinger, savior and suspect. To speak her name was to invoke both gratitude and dread. And though the town pretended to go about its business, each family knew that one day their own door might be the next to hear her knock. Corinth in 1875 was a place caught between the ruins of a war and the promises of a future that never fully arrived. The Civil War had torn through Mississippi like a scythe, leaving burned farms, widowed households, and a population fractured along the same battle lines that once divided the nation. Reconstruction was supposed to heal those wounds, but in towns like Corinth, it often deepened them. The railroad had made the settlement a key crossroads during the conflict, and the scars of occupation lingered. Abandoned depots, fields sown but never harvested, walls still pitted with shot. Families who had once owned plantations now struggled to coax cotton from exhausted soil. Freedmen sought wages for their labor, only to find themselves bound by debt peonage that looked too much like the chains they thought they had escaped. Amid this uneasy rebuilding, morality and survival were locked in a fragile embrace. The church was the axis around which most lives turned, yet the steeple bells rang above hunger, disease, and resentment. Faith promised order where chaos had ruled, but superstition filled the gaps where sermons failed. Mothers tied red strings around their infants' wrists to ward off fevers. Men carried rabbit bones in pockets for luck on the hunt. These practices were not considered foreign, but necessary. Remnants of African, native, and European traditions blending into a single, often unspoken language of survival. The official voice of the pulpit might condemn such rituals, but even deacons' wives tucked dried herbs above doorframes when illness spread. It was within this mixture of devotion and dread that Martha Elkins thrived. Doctors trained in Memphis or New Orleans rarely made their way to rural Alcorn County. When they did, their services were prohibitively expensive for farmers living on the edge of ruin. A woman like Martha filled the void. drawing on a half-learned science of midwifery and a deep well of inherited remedies. She could recite the Lord's Prayer while preparing a poultice of comfrey root, moving seamlessly between scripture and tradition. To some, this made her a bridge between old and new. To others, it branded her as dangerous, an interloper on sacred ground who trafficked in mysteries better left untouched. The social order of Corinth magnified every suspicion. White families tolerated Martha because they had little choice. Freed families relied on her because they were often refused treatment by white physicians. Yet this reliance created tension. If a black infant died under her care, whispers of negligence flared. If a white child died, the town muttered about curses and divine punishment. The irony was sharp. In death, Martha was accused of both favoritism and malice, as though her hands could tip the balance of survival according to whim. Geography compounded the atmosphere of foreboding. Corinth was surrounded by forests that closed in like a wall, thick with pine and oak, casting long shadows even in summer. Roads turned to swamps after storms, isolating farms for weeks at a time. Nightfall arrived with a silence broken only by frogs and the distant howl of hounds. In such darkness, stories spread quickly. Children were told to stay indoors after sunset, not only because of bandits or wild animals, but because the grave woman walks. Town, already conditioned by loss and fear, found in Martha a vessel for its anxieties. The contrast of the time was stark. Railroads promising progress, yet hunger gnawed at households. Churches preaching salvation, yet coffins filled at a pace that mocked those promises. Corinth was a place where the soil itself seemed uncertain, yielding both cotton and graves in equal measure. In this fragile balance, Martha Elkins became more than a midwife. She was a figure upon whom the town projected its dread. The embodiment of their question: had reconstruction brought them back to life, or had it merely prolonged the dying? It is against this backdrop of fragile survival and unhealed wounds that her story unfolds. Every suspicion about her hands, every whispered rumor about her key to coffins, is rooted in this soil of contradiction, faith tangled with fear, progress colliding with superstition, life struggling in the shadow of death. Corinth was not merely the stage for Martha's story. It was the crucible that forged it. The first of the deaths to raise real suspicion came in the late spring of 1875, when the wife of a tenant farmer named Elias Macready went into labor on a rain-swollen evening. The Macreadys were not wealthy, but they were decent. Church-going folk who had prayed long for a child. Neighbors recalled that Elias had built a small cradle with his own hands. During the winter, smoothing the wood so carefully that no splinter could ever mar the baby's skin. When the time came, he saddled his mule and rode through the downpour to fetch the only person he trusted to guide his wife through the ordeal, Martha Elkins. Martha arrived before midnight, a lantern in one hand, her black shawl dripping with rain. Inside the one-room cabin, the air was thick with the scent of damp wood and sweat. Sarah Macready labored for hours, her cries carrying into the yard where Elias knelt in prayer. Neighbors who gathered on the porch later said they heard Martha's voice rise and fall in a rhythm that was not quite prayer and not quite command, a low murmur that unsettled those who listened too closely. When at last the labor ended, the house fell into an eerie silence. No infant cry broke through, no sound of relief or joy. Only Martha's voice was heard instructing Elias to fetch cloths and dig a small hole in the far corner of the garden. The child, a boy, was delivered still and limp. Martha wrapped him in swaddling she herself had brought, muttering that it was better this way, God's mercy. Sarah, exhausted and pale, never saw her son. Martha told her he had been called back to heaven before he could take his first breath. By morning, a tiny coffin had been hammered together from spare boards, and Elias stood trembling as he lowered it into the earth. In his grief, he wrote a short letter to his brother in Tennessee, saying only, "The child came in silence. Martha says the Lord spared him a harder road. I do not know how to pray anymore." That letter, preserved by the family, became one of the earliest private records of unease. What struck the community was not the death itself, stillbirths, were sorrowfully common, but the manner in which Martha handled it. Neighbors noticed she refused to let the grieving parents hold their child. They whispered that she folded the tiny body as though it were an object rather than flesh and blood. She left the cabin before dawn, her lantern cutting through the mist like a solitary will-o'-the-wisp, and she did not stay to comfort the family. To some, this was proof of professionalism, a woman hardened by long years of practice. To others, it was chilling, the behavior of someone too familiar with death. The church ledger recorded the burial in terse script. Infant son of Elias and Sarah Macready, stillborn, April 28, 1875. The entry was almost identical to dozens before it, yet the repetition itself began to gnaw at the townsfolk. How many stillborns had Martha attended? How many coffins had been lowered into the clay with her hand guiding the way? The contrast between the cradle Elias built and the coffin he was forced to commission became a symbol of unease. In the weeks that followed, Elias was seen at Sunday service, his head bowed but his hands shaking. Sarah seldom left her bed. Some whispered she no longer trusted the midwife, who had denied her even the chance to see her child. Others said she spoke Martha's name only in hushed tones, fearful of inviting her shadow back into the house. What had been a private sorrow soon became public conversation. Why did the baby never cry? Did Martha close his mouth with her own hands? Though no accusation was made outright, this first incident planted the seed. The town began to tally its losses, to compare stories of Martha's visits. What might have been dismissed as fate began to resemble pattern, and the silence of one infant became an echo that lingered over Corinth like a gathering storm. By midsummer of that same year, Corinth had not yet recovered from the grief that shadowed the Macready home when another case, darker and more confounding, stirred the town into murmurs that could not easily be silenced. This time the tragedies struck a woman of standing, a widow named Clara Jennings, whose late husband had been a Confederate officer. Clara was known for her sharp wit and for managing her small estate with uncommon skill in a world that doubted a woman's competence. She was also beloved by the church community, a regular presence in the front pew, her black veils a reminder of a grief she wore openly but with dignity. When news spread that she was carrying twins despite her widowhood, curiosity mingled with admiration. For many, the expected birth symbolized renewal, a fresh joy breaking through the long shadows of war and loss. On the night her labor began, the Jennings home filled with a quiet tension. Servants moved in and out with steaming basins and linens. A neighbor was dispatched for Martha Elkins, for no one else in Corinth had the experience to manage a delivery of twins. By the time she arrived, lantern light flickered across worried faces, and Clara herself was pale but resolute, whispering prayers between her contractions. Witnesses later said Martha seemed composed, her shawl pulled tight, her satchel heavy with vials and folded cloths. She dismissed the men from the room as she always did, and closed the door with a finality that unsettled those left waiting outside. The first child, a boy, came into the world with a weak cry. According to those who heard it through the thin wooden walls, the sound was faint but real, a fragile life demanding its place. Within moments, though, silence followed. Martha was heard speaking sharply, almost scolding, and then the baby's cry ceased altogether. A few minutes later, she opened the door just enough to tell the household that the boy had not been meant for this world. The body, wrapped in white cloth, was placed aside with clinical detachment. The second child, a girl, was delivered not long after. This infant appeared healthier, with lungs strong enough to fill the house with piercing wails. Relief washed over those waiting, and a servant carried word to the church bell ringer, who told 3 slow notes customary to announce new life in town. Clara, exhausted, wept in gratitude, clinging to the belief that one child was still spared her. For 3 days, the surviving twin thrived. She was named Hope, a name Clara believed divinely inspired. But on the 4th day, the infant was found lifeless in her cradle. Clara's maid swore that Martha had visited the day before, insisting she needed to check the child's humors. No one saw precisely what she did, but the maid remembered the midwife bending close to the infant, muttering in her low rhythm, the same cadence neighbors had remarked upon months earlier at the Macready farm. When questioned later, the maid recalled a chill in the room after Martha left, as if the air itself had thickened. By dawn, the baby's skin was cold, her eyes half open. Clara, undone by grief, screamed so violently that neighbors rushed across the fields to her aid. The contrast between double blessing and double burial was too sharp to ignore. 2 cradles had been readied, yet 2 coffins were lowered within a week. The townspeople gathered at the cemetery described Clara collapsing over the graves, whispering that Martha had stolen. More than her children, she had stolen the last of her will to live. Though Clara survived her sorrow, she was never seen again in the front pew of the church. Artifacts from this incident survive in fragments. A servant's testimony was entered briefly into a deacon's personal journal, noting her suspicions of the midwife's visit. The church ledger, written in the same tight script as before, contained back-to-back entries. Infant son of Clara Jennings, deceased at birth, and days later, infant daughter, Hope Jennings, deceased in infancy. The title ink had scarcely dried on the first before the second was written. The ledger, still preserved in brittle pages, stands a silent testimony to the grim repetition. This second incident spread unease far beyond whispers. It reached into households that had once defended Martha. If tragedy could strike Clara Jennings, a woman of such standing, then no one was safe. Faith that had once explained away losses, the will of God now cracked, under the weight of patterns too deliberate to dismiss. Coffins were no longer seen as accidents of birth, but as companions that followed wherever Martha's shadow fell. And so suspicion, once a whisper in corners, began to stir openly in the pews, in the market stalls, and in the eyes of every husband watching the midwife walk toward his home. The third incident that burned Martha Elkins's name deeper into Corinth's memory came in late autumn of 1875, when the harvest fields lay bare and the first frosts silvered the edges of the pine woods. This time the tragedy touched a family, already burdened by the weight of suspicion and prejudice. A freedman named Samuel Carter and his young wife, Lisa. Samuel had fought to establish himself after emancipation, renting a modest cabin on the outskirts of town and working long hours in the cotton fields to save for a plot of his own. To the white landowners of Corinth he was tolerated, but never truly accepted. For Samuel and Lisa, the birth of their first child symbolized more than family. It represented hope, continuity, and the promise of permanence in a place that often reminded them they did not belong. When Liza's labor began, Samuel had no choice but to summon Martha. Few doctors would treat black families, and those who did often demanded fees Samuel could not afford. Martha arrived at their cabin in the same manner she always did, shawl draped, satchel in hand, her presence both reassuring and unsettling. Neighbors, black and white alike, would later recall seeing her lantern light through the thin cracks of the cabin walls, flickering like a signal in the night. Inside, Liza fought through her contractions with quiet determination, her hands clenching the quilt Samuel's mother had sewn years before on the plantation. Samuel prayed aloud, alternating between whispered scripture and fragments of spirituals, asking God not to take this blessing away. By dawn, the child had come, a baby girl, her skin pink, her cries strong enough to pierce the cold morning air. Relief filled the small cabin. Samuel wept openly, declaring her the first Carter born free. But the joy was short-lived. Within hours, the infant's wails weakened, her breaths turned shallow. Liza herself grew pale, her strength draining rapidly as if something unseen were being pulled from her body. Martha, unmoved, instructed Samuel to fetch more wood for the fire, muttering that the humors are failing. By the time Samuel returned, his wife was slumped in her bedding, and the child had fallen silent against her breast. Both were gone, taken within a span of minutes. Samuel's grief was matched only by his fury. He stormed into town days later, clutching the small bundle that held his daughter's swaddling, demanding answers from anyone who would listen. He claimed Martha had pressed herbs against Liza's lips, whispering words he could not understand, and that she had hidden the child's face from him before death claimed her. His accusations, however, fell on divided ears. Among black neighbors, his story was believed immediately, a confirmation of suspicions long held in silence. Among white townsfolk, the tragedy was dismissed as nature's cruelty or God's inscrutable will. Some even went so far as to suggest Samuel's overexcitement had misled him, a thinly veiled way of saying his grief made him unreliable. This dismissal cut deeper than the loss itself. Samuel petitioned the sheriff, Ely Carter, no relation, who agreed to record his complaint but stopped, short of opening a formal inquiry. The sheriff's terse logbook, still preserved, contains only a single line: Friedman reports loss of wife and infant, alleges misconduct of midwife, concluded natural causes, matter closed. It is a record as cold as the ground in which Lisa and her child were laid. The contrast here was agonizing. Freedom promised, yet denied. Life expected, yet snatched away. Samuel had believed in the possibility of a future untethered from chains, only to watch both wife and daughter lowered into the earth in the same grave. The white community, meanwhile, seized upon the incident in a different way. Some whispered that Martha had overstepped by tending to freed families at all, as though her presence in their cabins blurred boundaries that should remain. Others quietly wondered why death followed her so reliably across both black and white households. For once, suspicion was no longer contained to a single corner of Corinth. It bled across the color line, uniting distrust where little else could. This third incident completed the pattern that many had tried to ignore. One infant stillborn, two twins lost in sequence, and now a mother and her child claimed together. The coffins piled too high, the explanations too thin. A phrase began circulating in churchyards and market stalls, whispered with equal parts fear and certainty. Where Martha walks, death follows. Whether spoken by black farmers or white planters, the sentiment was the same. Corinth had begun to see not just tragedy, but intention, and that shift from sorrow to suspicion would alter the course of the town's history forever. Sheriff Ely Carter was not a man prone to superstition. A veteran of the war, he had seen enough death on battlefields to resist the easy explanations that others reached for when grief demanded a target. Yet by the close of 1875, with so many burials traced back to the same midwife, even he could not ignore the whispers gathering in Corinth. Though no formal charge had been filed against Martha Elkins, the unease in town was palpable. Church deacons lingered after service in low conversation. Farmers at the market exchanged glances when her name was mentioned. Mothers clutched their infants tighter when she walked past. Ely understood that order depended not only on the law, but on perception, and perception was quickly turning against the midwife. He began his inquiry quietly without announcement, for he knew that public accusation without evidence could plunge the town into hysteria. His first step was to revisit the homes where the tragedies had struck. At the McCready farm, he spoke with Elias, who by then had taken to long silences and slow prayers, his voice hollowed by loss. Elias confessed he could not remember the moment of his son's passing clearly, only that Martha had insisted the infant never drew breath. Ely noted the detail, writing in his small logbook, "Father states child delivered still." No proof otherwise. Midwife insisted burial at once. At the Jennings estate he met with Clara herself. She received him in a dim parlor, her face thin from grief, her eyes ringed in shadows. Clara admitted that she had not held either of her twins alive. Martha, she said, had kept the bodies from her sight, claiming it would only deepen her suffering. "But a mother knows," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. One of them cried, "Sheriff, I swear it." For a moment she lived. Ely recorded her words with care, underlining them twice in his ledger. He left the estate with the echo of that sentence heavy in his ears. When he visited Samuel Carter, the freedman's fury was still raw. Samuel repeated his account of Martha pressing herbs to Liza's lips and muttering, words he could not decipher. Unlike the other families, Samuel demanded action. "If she were anyone else," he shouted, "you'd have her in irons already." Eli attempted to soothe him, reminding Samuel that accusations without proof would be thrown aside by the court. Still, Samuel's words unsettled him, and in his logbook Eli wrote, "Husband certain, wife and child lost to midwife's interference. Claims strange words, herb smell, refusal to allow him near. Notable anger, not without reason." In the course of his inquiry, Eli spoke also with neighbors and servants who had been present in those homes. Their testimonies varied. Some dismissed Martha's behavior as ordinary practice. Others recalled details that struck him as odd. A servant at the Jennings household insisted she heard the second twin crying after Martha announced her death. Another claimed Martha carried a small brass key that she pressed to the lips of the deceased before burial, a detail Eli underlined but could not yet verify. The pattern forming in his notes was troubling: secrecy, control of the bodies, and a refusal to let parents or kin confirm the deaths with their own eyes. Eli Carter was bound by contrast. As sheriff, he was tasked with upholding order, yet his investigation threatened to disturb the fragile stability of Corinth. On one hand stood the law, demanding evidence before action. On the other stood silence, the heavy pressure of a community, willing to let tragedy pass unchallenged, if it meant avoiding scandal. He found himself walking the line between them, unsure whether he was preserving peace or enabling a darker truth to fester. His logbook entries from those weeks survive, their spelling uneven, their sentences clipped, but the tone unmistakable. Too many losses, same midwife always present, no clear cause, no witnesses to moment of death. Cannot prove, cannot ignore. In those words, we glimpse a man wrestling, not only with the weight of duty, but with the possibility that what the townsfolk whispered might be more than mere rumor. By the end of his quiet inquiry, Eli had not yet moved against Martha, but his doubts had hardened. In private, he confided to a deacon that something foul shadowed her work. He could not name it, could not pin it to law, yet he felt its presence as surely as the smell of earth on a freshly dug grave. His investigation, though unofficial, marked the first time an authority figure put suspicion to paper. And once suspicion is written down, it is no longer just a whisper. It becomes record, and records are harder to bury than the smallest of coffins. It was not Sheriff Eli, Carter's ledger alone that began to give the suspicions surrounding Martha Elkins the weight of permanence. In Corinth, the church ledger was regarded with even greater authority than the sheriff's notes, for it stood as both sacred record and civic memory. Every birth, every baptism, every marriage, every death was inscribed in its pages by the hand of Deacon Josiah Turner, a man known for his precise script and rigid devotion to truth as he saw it. The ledger did not embellish, it simply recorded, and in that simplicity lay its power. In the late autumn of 1875, as burials continued to accumulate, Deacon Turner began to notice a disturbing pattern. During one evening in the vestry, by the light of a single oil lamp, he spread out the year's entries, comparing baptisms with burials. He realized that the column of deaths outpaced the column of births by an alarming margin, a contrast that contradicted the very rhythm of life in a small town. In a healthy community, baptisms should have outweighed funerals, at least among the young. Yet here the opposite seemed to be true. He underlined the names of families who had called on Martha Elkins and saw, with growing unease, how often her presence was followed by a burial within days. What disturbed him most was the clustering. The Macready infant, the Jennings twins, the Carter mother and child, all within a span of months. Each case might be explained away as misfortune, but together they formed a grim pattern. In the margins of the ledger, Turner made a rare personal note: cannot be coincidence. One hand too often near death. Must pray for discernment. That single line, scribbled in his otherwise immaculate record, still survives, ink faded but legible, a testament to the first formal recognition that suspicion had become more than idle talk. The contrast in this section of the story was stark. Sacred record versus statistical dread. The ledger was meant to be a tool of reassurance, a reminder that every soul was accounted for before God, yet when read closely, it became an indictment, revealing death's disproportionate claim on the households touched by Martha. Numbers stripped of rumor carried a weight gossip never could. The deacon did not accuse her outright. His position demanded restraint, but the act of calculation itself was radical. He had taken what was spoken in whispers and given it form in ink. Word of Turner's concerns began to circulate quietly among the congregation. Some resisted, unwilling to believe that a woman entrusted with so many births could also be the harbinger of so many deaths. Others seized upon the numbers as confirmation of what they had long feared. The Jennings servants spoke more boldly, insisting their testimony had been ignored. Samuel Carter found bitter validation in the ledger's cold arithmetic. Even the Macreadys, once resigned to their sorrow as fate, began to reconsider the silence that followed their child's delivery. By the time the ledger was read aloud at a late-year church meeting, the effect was electric. Turner did not editorialize. He merely pointed out the ratio. 22 births recorded, 13 burials of infants and young mothers within days of delivery. Nearly all had one detail in common: the midwife's hand. Gasps filled the sanctuary, and even those who had defended Martha in the past shifted uneasily in their pews. This was the moment when the community could no longer dismiss the tragedies as isolated misfortunes. The ledger transformed grief into evidence, sorrow into statistics. It was no longer just stories of a grieving husband or a distraught widow. It was a pattern written in the same ink that chronicled baptisms and marriages. And because it was written in that book, the people of Corinth could not simply turn the page. At this point in the narrative, tension rises sharply. And so, for those of you listening now, consider this. What weight do you give to numbers when they contradict the comforts of faith or tradition? Do you see in them truth or only what you wish to see? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do these statistics convince you, or are they still only shadows of coincidence? The midwife's shadow was no longer confined to rumor. It had been bound into the town's holiest record, a proof no longer whispered but spoken aloud. And in Corinth, 1875, the weight of a number could feel heavier than the weight of a coffin. By the turn of the new year, the people of Corinth were no longer speaking in cautious half-sentences. What had once been a whisper on porches and in pews had ripened into open dread, and the name Martha Elkins carried with it the sting of accusation. Though never yet spoken directly to her face, families who had once called for her in times of labor began to look elsewhere, even if it meant fetching a stranger from a neighboring county. Yet those who had no choice, the poor, the isolated, those without kin, still found her at their bedside, and the unease in their eyes showed they knew what others now believed. The rumors twisted into forms darker than any ledger entry. Some said Martha carried a hidden satchel of powders that could still a newborn's breath with a pinch upon the lips. Others swore she spoke words in a tongue not heard in church, a language that pulled shadows across the room like curtains. A farmer's wife whispered that she had seen Martha kneel by a coffin before burial, pressing her brass key to the child's chest as if locking the soul away. No proof was ever offered, only testimony told in kitchens and smokehouses, where fear thickened as easily as steam. The contrast here was glaring. On one side, the people of Corinth needed midwives more than ever, for childbirth was perilous, and physicians were scarce and costly. On the other side, Martha was now believed to be both healer and harbinger, one whose touch might save but more often condemn. To shun her entirely was to risk delivering without skilled hands. To accept her help was to gamble with both mother and child. This tension deepened the town's unease, binding them to her, even as they sought to escape her. Sheriff Eli Carter felt the shift in atmosphere most keenly. Where once his investigation had been a quiet effort, he now found himself pressed daily by townsfolk. Samuel Carter cornered him outside the general store, demanding arrest. Clara Jennings wrote a letter to the sheriff's office, begging that he protect the innocent yet to be born, even Deacon Turner, who had been measured in his language, asked in a closed meeting why the law remained silent when the church ledger already spoke so clearly. Eli, in his own words, felt as though the town's peace was slipping through his fingers like water through a sieve. Artifacts from this period survive in the form of anonymous notes left under Eli's door. One scrawled in hurried pencil read, "If you will not stop her, others will. She buries more than babes." Another, written in steadier hand, warned, "Sheriff, the people murmur. If justice does not come by law, it will come by fire." These scraps, brittle and browned by time, reveal not only the fear of Martha Elkins, but also the rising danger of mob justice, a threat that weighed heavily on Eli's conscience. And yet, Martha herself seemed untouched by the storm gathering around her. Witnesses recalled that she moved through town with the same measured pace, head high, basket in hand. Some said she met stares with calm, others that she returned glares with a faint smile that only deepened suspicions. Was it defiance, or simply the composure of a woman long accustomed to being judged? This ambiguity only sharpened the town's division. To her defenders, she appeared unfairly maligned. To her detractors, she looked every bit the witch they now called her in hushed tones. The rumors hardened into belief one evening, when a child, not yet 2, fell ill and died after Martha visited the home. There was no clear evidence of wrongdoing, no one saw her give herbs or mutter prayers, but the timing alone was enough. At the next church service, several families refused to sit in the pews nearest hers. Mothers clutched their infants so tightly their arms shook. The sanctuary, meant to unite the faithful, now displayed its fracture openly, faith in God's mercy on one side, fear of a woman who seemed to command death on the other. This was the threshold moment when suspicion became certainty in the public mind. Numbers in a ledger had revealed a troubling pattern, but stories, sharpened by grief and retold with fervor, gave that pattern a face. In Corinth's collective imagination, Martha Elkins was no longer a servant of life, but a keeper of keys to coffins, moving silently from house to house, one hand lifting infants into the world, the other ushering them out. By the time snow fell lightly across the Mississippi fields that winter, it was no longer a question of whether she was guilty, but what should be done about her. And the louder the whispers grew, the more dangerous the silence of the law became. The town was balanced precariously between order and chaos, between lawful inquiry and the violence of a fearful crowd. All it would take was a single spark. The spark came not from rumor, but from paper. Sheriff Eli Carter's logbook, kept in neat if weary script, contained details he never meant for the public to see. Yet in February of 1876, several of its pages slipped into wider circulation, whether by theft, betrayal, or simple carelessness. No one ever proved. What matters is that the town of Corinth suddenly had access to words that had been meant only for an officer's eye. And once read aloud in kitchens and at store counters, those words carried a weight that no whisper could match. The entries were plain, almost clinical, yet their very sparseness gave them authority. One read, "Father insists child lived briefly." A cry heard, midwife declared stillborn. Another noted, "Servant reports brass key pressed to lips of deceased. Cannot verify." Most damning was the sheriff's own reflection. Scrawled in frustration, "Too many losses. Same midwife always present. Cannot prove, cannot ignore." Though Eli had written these lines in private uncertainty, the townsfolk interpreted them as proof that even the law believed Martha guilty. In that gap between doubt and conviction, suspicion hardened into collective judgment. The artifact effect was devastating. Numbers in the church ledger had shown imbalance, but the sheriff's notes seemed to confess complicity. If even the man charged with maintaining order admitted something was wrong, then how could the town justify inaction? To many, the logbook was not evidence of caution, it was evidence of cowardice. And in that interpretation, Eli found himself not only questioning Martha but also defending his own integrity as sheriff. The contrast in this section could not have been sharper, secrecy versus exposure. Eli's private struggle, once confined to ink and paper, had now been laid bare before the very people he sought to protect. His careful neutrality, the shield he believed preserved order, now looked like weakness. The townsfolk, hungry for decisive action, no longer wanted a sheriff who observed. They wanted a sheriff who acted. At the general store, men gathered to debate what should be done. Some called for her immediate arrest, though by what charge they could not say. Others argued for banishment, the kind of extrajudicial exile that had ended disputes in harsher times. Samuel Carter, ever unrelenting, declared that if the law would not move, the community must. Better her gone than another child in the ground, he said, his voice carrying through the crowded room. The statement was repeated so often afterward, it became a kind of refrain. Meanwhile, Eli himself grew more unsettled. His later testimony and correspondence with a county judge reveals his torment. In one surviving letter, he wrote, "I fear the people's justice will come swifter than mine. If so, blood will be on all our hands." That letter, never sent, was found folded between the logbook's later pages. It shows a man aware that the balance had tipped beyond his control, yet still unwilling to leap without legal proof. And then came the anonymous artifact that pushed suspicion into the realm of certainty for many. A letter unsigned appeared in Deacon Turner's mailbox, written in a shaky hand. It claimed to be from a grieving mother whose child Martha had delivered. The letter read in part, "I heard the cry." She silenced it with a cloth. She said it was mercy. "I cannot bear this silence any longer." Whether genuine or fabricated, the effect was catastrophic. The church meeting where Turner read it aloud ended in uproar. Women wept openly, men shouted for immediate retribution, and the deacon himself, usually measured, admitted he could no longer shield the town from its own conscience. From that moment, Corinth was no longer debating whether Martha Elkins posed a danger. They were debating what punishment she deserved. Some whispered of trials, others of fires. Still others of simply letting her vanish into the woods and never return. Martha, they agreed, held the key to too many coffins. What they could not agree on was whether to wait for law or seize justice with their own hands. It was at this juncture that Eli Carter realized he was standing not between innocence and guilt, but between two forms of ruin. The slow erosion of law or the swift descent into mob violence. And as the winter deepened, so too did the urgency of that choice. The sheriff's logbook, once a private ledger of doubt, had become a catalyst for public fury. And once fury is written into the record of a town, it does not fade easily. It demands action one way or another. The choice came crashing into Sheriff Eli Carter's world on a night when the air itself seemed restless. A gathering storm rattled the shutters of Corinth. But inside the town hall, the true thunder was made by voices. Dozens of men had crowded into the room, called together not by official decree, but by urgency that could no longer be contained. The pewter lamps on the walls cast long shadows, throwing every furrowed brow and clenched jaw into sharp relief. This was no meeting of neighbors seeking compromise. It was the sound of a community preparing to act. Eli stood at the front, hat in hand, his logbook closed on the table beside him. He began by pleading for patience, reminding the assembly that without proof, the law could not hold. But the words fell into a sea that had already risen past his shoulders. Samuel Carter leapt to his feet, voice shaking with fury. "How many more mothers must we bury before you decide what proof looks like?" His words struck like a hammer, and others echoed him. To their minds, the ledger and the notes already were proof. To delay further was to gamble with more lives. The debate split the room into two fierce camps. On one side were those who clung to procedure, urging Eli to press the county court for formal charges, even if it meant waiting weeks for a hearing. On the other side were the men who had grown weary of waiting, who feared that every hour Martha remained free was an hour another infant might be lost. Between them was the raw contrast of law versus mob, restraint versus vengeance. The atmosphere thickened with it, until even Eli could feel that words alone would not hold them together. It was then that Deacon Turner rose, holding in his hand the anonymous letter that had shaken the church days before. His voice trembled as he read it aloud once more, the lines accusing Martha of silencing a child's first cry. The room fell quiet, as if the very timbers of the hall strained to listen. Turner lowered the paper and looked at Eli. If the law cannot move, then the Lord's people must. We cannot let her hands deliver another soul to the grave. Coming from the deacon, a man of caution and scripture, the words carried a finality that few dared challenge. Eli's stomach tightened as he saw the shift in the room. The men were no longer debating whether to act. They were deciding how. Some shouted for immediate arrest. Others demanded exile, while a few, their voices edged with something darker, muttered about fire cleansing what the law refused to touch. The sheriff knew well what such talk meant. In Mississippi, not a decade removed from war, justice could turn into spectacle before a man could draw his weapon. Artifacts from that night preserved the tone of the gathering. A rough petition, signed by nearly 20 men, demanded that Martha be held and questioned by the community until truth be shown. Another scrap, unsigned, carried only 3 words: rope before dawn. Both documents remain as chilling reminders of how swiftly grief can harden into threat. Eli tried once more to steady the crowd. He promised to confront Martha directly, to demand answers to the suspicions written in both church and sheriff's books. But it must be done under law, he insisted. If we become lawless, we are no better than what we accuse. His words drew murmurs, some nodding, others sneering. It was not a victory, but it bought him a narrow thread of time. The men agreed grudgingly to let him approach Martha first. Yet their warning was clear: if he failed to act, they would. The contrast at this moment was not just between justice and vengeance, but between one man's conscience and the collective will of a town. Eli Carter left the hall, knowing he carried not only his badge but the fragile weight of peace on his shoulders. The crowd dispersed into the storm outside, but their footsteps echoed like a verdict already spoken. Corinth had passed from rumor into decision, and all that remained was the confrontation itself. In later years, when descendants recalled the winter of 1876, they would speak of that night in the town hall as the turning point. It was the moment when suspicion ceased to be a private grief and became a public mandate. The sheriff had been given one last chance to resolve it with law. If he failed, Corinth would take matters into its own hands, and the key to every coffin might soon open Martha Elkins's own. Sheriff Eli Carter chose a cold morning in late February to confront Martha Elkins. The air was sharp with frost, the kind that stiffened fields into silence and set every sound against the stillness. He walked alone to her small cabin on the outskirts of Corinth, carrying with him not just his badge and revolver, but the weight of a town's rage pressing at his back. The ground crunched beneath his boots, and with every step he felt the eyes of the community, though none followed him. They expected him to bring back answers, or failing that, to bring back chains. Martha's cabin stood among bare pecan trees, its roof sagging, its porch leaning as though burdened by years of secrecy. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney, carrying with it the smell of dried herbs, bitter and sweet at once. Eli paused at the door, breathing in the air, and thought of all the mothers who had died behind closed doors like this one. He knocked, and the sound echoed with a weight that seemed out of place for such a modest home. After a moment Martha appeared, her face composed, her dark eyes steady. She did not seem surprised. "Sheriff," she said simply, as though she had been expecting him. Inside, the cabin was orderly, almost unnervingly so. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters. Jars of tinctures lined the shelves. A small cradle sat in the corner, empty but polished, as if it had been prepared for use that never came. On the table lay a small brass key, gleaming despite the dim light. Eli's eyes caught on it immediately. "What's that for?" he asked. Martha did not flinch. "Every midwife has tools," she replied softly. "This one opens what others would keep shut." The exchange marked the start of their confrontation. Eli, voice firm, laid out the accusations. Infants declared stillborn without witnesses. Mothers who died suddenly after labor. Servants who swore they heard cries. the deacon's ledger and his own logbook entries. Each word struck like a hammer, yet Martha did not yield. She listened, hands folded, her face calm as stone. When he finished, she asked, "And what do you believe, Sheriff? Do you think I hold death in my hands, or is it only sorrow that follows me?" Eli faltered, for this was the heart of his torment. In his logbook he had written doubt, not certainty. And standing before her now, he saw not the image of a witch, but a weary woman whose life had been spent in the service of others. Yet he could not deny the pattern, nor the rising danger from those who had lost faith in her. "I believe too many coffins carry your name," he answered at last, "and I cannot ignore it any longer." The conversation that followed was layered with contrasts, healer versus harbinger, law versus law, truth versus perception. Martha defended herself not with denial, but with a strange, solemn reasoning. She spoke of mothers too weak to survive, of children born too frail, of mercies given to spare suffering. "You call it killing," she said, her voice low, "but I call it releasing. Better a still silence than a lifetime of pain. You think me cruel, but I have seen cruelty in the cries of babes who cannot breathe, and mothers who beg for peace as their bodies fail." Eli recoiled, for though she did not confess outright, her words seemed to skirt the edge of admission. He saw in them not evil alone, but a philosophy, an unsettling conviction that what she did was, guided by compassion, twisted into something terrible. He pressed her further, the brass key, the whispered words, the hurried burials. Martha lifted the key, turned it once in her fingers, and replied, "It is a symbol, Sheriff. For every door I close, another one opens. For every coffin, a passage. Do not think me careless. I carry every soul with me." Artifacts later claimed to be found in her home reinforced the unease. Among them was a small bundle of notes written in a delicate hand, cataloguing births and deaths in her care. Some entries were marked with symbols, a circle, a cross, a spiral that no one could interpret. Whether they were records, prayers, or codes, no one could agree. But their very existence suggested a hidden system of meaning, a private reckoning known only to her. The confrontation ended without arrest. Eli, torn between duty and doubt, left the cabin with more questions than answers. Martha watched him go, her figure framed by the doorway, the brass key glinting in her hand. He felt the weight of the town pressing harder now, for he knew that his hesitation would be seen as failure. Yet he also knew that what he had witnessed was not the face of simple malice, but of something far more complex, a woman who believed herself to be both servant and sentinel of life and death. That night, Eli wrote in his logbook, "Confronted Martha. No confession, only riddles. Believes mercy, justifies silence. Cannot prove crime, yet cannot dismiss. People will not wait." The words capture the very heart of the crisis. A lawman caught between a woman's quiet, conviction, and a community's rising hunger for judgment. The fragile thread he had been walking was fraying, and with each passing day, the town's patience thinned like ice over a river ready to crack. The days after Sheriff Eli Carter's visit to Martha, Elkins's cabin unfolded like the tightening of a noose. The town of Corinth had waited for its lawman to return with a resolution. But when word spread that Martha still walked free, whispers turned to open threats. Farmers muttered at the market that if the sheriff would not carry out justice, others would. At the churchyard, women who had once shared hymnals with Martha now refused to meet her gaze, clutching their children as though she carried death itself in her basket. Silence, once her shield, had now become her sentence. By the first week of March, a group of men gathered after dusk near the blacksmith's shed, lanterns held low. They were not boys chasing rumor, but householders, fathers and husbands who had buried too much. Their voices were hushed, but their intent was loud in the air. Martha would be taken. Whether she would stand before a trial or a tree was a matter yet undecided. Among them stood Samuel Carter, whose grief burned hotter than the others' suspicion. He reminded the group of the herbs pressed to his wife's lips, of the muffled cries that haunted his nights. "We cannot let her tend another birth," he said, and his words drew grim nods. It was here that the contrast became starkest. lawful restraint against mob resolve, order against chaos. Eli, when he learned of the meeting, rushed to intervene. He rode into town under cover of night and entered the shed where the men conspired. His presence silenced them, but not their anger. He demanded that any action go through him, through the law, through evidence. But the men no longer trusted his restraint. "You confronted her and left her be," one spat. "How many more must die before you admit what we already know?" Eli felt his authority slipping. His badge, no heavier than tin in the face of grief, turned militant. Still, he pleaded for time, for the court to weigh testimony. But time was the one thing the people of Corinth refused to grant. The ledger had shown too many burials, his logbook too many doubts, and the anonymous letter too much horror. To them it was already trial enough. As the night wore on, Eli realized that his words brought him only a brittle compromise. They would wait 3 days. If in that time he did not act, they would. Artifacts of this turning point survive in 2 forms. First, a torn page from Eli's logbook. Written hastily that night, crowd forming, cannot hold them much longer. Justice by rope feared, must act or lose control entirely. Second, a fragment of testimony from Clara Jennings, who later recalled overhearing men in the churchyard say, "The key she carries won't open her way out." Not this time. These pieces serve as chilling reminders of how swiftly a community can pivot from grief to collective threat. Martha herself seemed aware of the storm gathering. Neighbors reported seeing her more often at dusk, walking alone near the edge of the fields, sometimes pausing as though listening for something in the distance. Some claim she left small bundles, herbs wrapped in cloth, tokens of bone or wood, on the thresholds of homes where infants had died. Whether these were offerings, apologies, or warnings, no one knew. But the sight of them hardened suspicion, transforming fear into anger. To the townsfolk they looked like markers, as though she were laying claim to the graves she had filled. The town's tension reached a fever pitch when another woman went into labor on the outskirts of Corinth. Her family, desperate and poor, had no choice but to call for Martha, for no physician could be fetched in time. News spread quickly, and a crowd began to form outside the small cabin, even as the birth was underway. People waited in the cold, breath fogging in the night air, listening for the sound of a cry or for silence. When at last the wail of a newborn pierced the darkness, relief surged through the crowd. But when Martha emerged, pale and weary, carrying not 1 but 2 infants, one alive, the other wrapped in cloth, the relief shattered. The living child was handed to its mother, but all eyes fixed on the still bundle. No one saw the moment of its passing, yet suspicion filled the void like smoke in a closed room. Shouts rose, "She's done it again!" Another coffin. The crowd pressed forward, demanding to see the infant, to hold it, to prove with their own eyes what Martha claimed. She refused, clutching the small bundle to her chest, insisting it was already gone, that nothing could have saved it. That refusal ignited the fury that had been building for months. Eli forced himself between Martha and the crowd, revolver drawn but pointed to the ground. "Enough!" he roared, though his voice trembled. "If there is to be judgment, it will be mine to bring. Not yours." The standoff crackled with danger between his solitary badge and the will of dozens, between his oath to the law and the mob's hunger for immediate reckoning. The 3 days of grace were over. Corinth had reached its breaking point, and Eli knew that one more heartbeat, one more breath, might tip the town into violence from which none could return. The confrontation had begun in earnest. What remained uncertain was whether it would end in trial, exile, or a pyre beneath the Mississippi sky. The standoff outside the birthing cabin marked the threshold, but it was what followed the next evening that tore the veil from order entirely. Word had spread quickly across Corinth that Martha Elkins had once again left a child wrapped in silence, and by dusk nearly half the town had gathered in the square. Lanterns swung in the wind, their flames trembling like the voices of the people who carried them. This was no longer rumor nor ledger debate. It was the swelling body of a community that had judged and was ready to carry out its sentence. Sheriff Eli Carter stood at the courthouse steps, rifle slung but not raised, his jaw tight. He addressed the crowd. reminding them of law, of due process, of the county judge whose arrival he had petitioned. But his words slid off them like water on stone. What they wanted was not process, but closure. "You've had your chance, Sheriff," one man shouted, "but she's still out there, walking free while our children lie cold." A chorus of agreement followed, punctuated by Samuel Carter's raw cry, "I buried my Liza. I buried my child. Must we bury justice too?" The crowd surged toward Martha's cabin. Eli followed, knowing he was no longer leading but chasing the tide. They reached her door just as she emerged, lantern in one hand, the small brass key in the other. She did not cower. She stood in the doorway as though expecting them, her face calm, her voice steady. "You want answers," she said, loud enough to be heard above the murmurs. "Come inside and see the truth, with your own eyes." The words gave the crowd pause, for they had expected resistance, not invitation. Yet suspicion is rarely softened by openness, and so they pressed forward. Inside her cabin, the air was heavy with the smell of dried roots and smoke. On the table lay her journals, filled with cramped handwriting, symbols scrawled in margins, names of mothers and infants meticulously recorded. Some entries bore marks, a circle beside the names of those who lived, a cross beside those who did not. The men seized upon the symbols as evidence of dark practices. Samuel Carter lifted one volume and read aloud. "Liza Carter, cross." His voice broke on the word, but his anger returned sharper than ever. To him, the journal was no mere record, it was a tally of guilt. Martha defended herself with calm conviction. "These marks are my prayers, my way of remembering every soul I carried into this world and every soul I carried out. Do you think I forget them? Do you think I do not weep for each?" But her explanation only deepened the crowd's unease. Prayer or proof, mercy or murder, they could not decide. But they knew only that too many crosses darkened those pages. The confrontation escalated when a young mother in the crowd, clutching her infant tight, accused Martha directly. "You would have taken mine too, if God hadn't stopped you." The words struck like a stone, and the crowd roared its agreement. Eli stepped forward, demanding quiet, but the tide was against him. Rough hands grabbed the journals, the jars of herbs, the brass key. They held them aloft as tokens of condemnation, shouting that they had found her instruments of death. Martha tried to seize the key back, but in the struggle it fell to the floor, clattering like a verdict already cast. Artifacts from that night, pages torn from the journals, a broken jar still stained with dried tincture would later surface in private collections. Fragments of what the townsfolk claimed was proof. But whether they were genuine or distorted by fear, they cemented the impression that the midwife's cabin had been less a place of healing than a workshop of coffins. The contrast was unbearable. The healer who saw herself as guardian of mercy, and the community who now saw her as executioner, cloaked in compassion. Eli shouted himself hoarse to keep the crowd from violence. But every second felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, with the ground crumbling beneath him. He managed, through sheer presence and authority, to drag Martha out under his protection, declaring that she would be held in the jail until the judge arrived. His words gave the mob just enough pause to keep fists from turning into firebrands. But the air was heavy with promise. If the law did not condemn her, Corinth would. The night ended with Martha locked behind iron bars, lanterns guttering in the square, and a silence far more dangerous than shouting. For silence, after fury, is never peace. It is the breath before the storm returns. Eli knew that he had only delayed the inevitable. The town's patience was gone, its verdict already written. What remained was the manner of its execution. The raid on Martha's cabin was the point of no return. The ledger had cast doubt, the sheriff's notes had fanned suspicion, but the journals and the brass key had sealed her fate. Whether she was guilty or misunderstood, Corinth had chosen its story, and stories once chosen are seldom unmade. The jailhouse in Corinth was little more than a single-room structure of brick and timber, its iron bars hammered by local smiths after the war. Martha Elkins sat within it now, hands folded on her lap, the small cot beneath her barely holding her frame. She looked not defeated, but eerily composed, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Sheriff Eli Carter paced outside the cell, revolver at his side, trying to ignore the pounding in his chest. The mob had dispersed reluctantly after he locked her inside, but he could feel their eyes, even now, peering through the dark, waiting for dawn or for their courage to return. The contrast inside and outside the jailhouse was stark. Within, Martha was calm, lantern light flickering across her pale face. Her voice soft when she finally spoke. "You think a cell holds me, Sheriff? It holds only your fear." Outside, the air vibrated with anger. Men muttering on the street, boots scuffing on dirt, women whispering that the midwife would never see trial. Eli was alone in his stand for order, a lawman clinging to procedure while the law itself seemed thinner than paper. The final confrontation began just after midnight. A stone shattered the window, followed by shouts demanding Martha's release, not to freedom but to judgment. Eli stormed out, rifle raised, warning the crowd to stand down. But his words carried no weight. Grief had hardened them beyond reason. Men surged forward with ropes coiled at their belts, women behind them carrying lanterns like torches. It was no longer a gathering of neighbors, but a tribunal of the enraged. Inside, Martha stood at the bars, watching the storm gather. She clutched the brass key, somehow retrieved from where it had fallen in the cabin, her fingers running over it as though it were rosary beads. When Eli turned back toward her, she smiled faintly. "They will take me, Sheriff, but it is not me they fear. It is the graves they cannot stop filling." Her words chilled him more than the mob's shouts. It was as if she had accepted her role, not as healer nor killer, but as vessel of the town's curse. The jail door buckled under blows from hammers and axes. Eli fired a warning shot into the air, the crack splitting the night. For a moment, the crowd froze, the echo ringing against the courthouse walls. But then Samuel Carter stepped forward, grief in his face and fury in his voice. "Sheriff, you can shoot me dead, but you'll still lose her. She took my child, and I'll see her pay." The crowd roared its agreement, their will drowning out the sheriff's authority. What happened next was chaos. The mob surged into the jail, overwhelming Eli, tearing the keys from his belt. He fought, striking with rifle and fists, but there were too many. Martha did not resist as they dragged her from the cell. She walked as though in procession, the brass key still clutched in her hand. Some swore she whispered prayers, others that she laughed softly under her breath. The crowd hauled her toward the oak tree on the edge of town, its limbs heavy and waiting, as though it had been grown for this moment. Artifacts later whispered of the rope used that night, strands of Martha's hair, fragments of her journal scattered in the dirt, would vanish into private hands, traded as relics of justice or curse, depending on who told the tale. What is known is that Eli tried once more to intervene, rifle raised against his own people, but Samuel Carter struck him down with the butt of an axe handle, leaving him bleeding in the dust. The sheriff's law had ended. The mob's law had begun. Martha was placed beneath the oak, the rope looped, lantern light painting her face in shadow and gold. She looked at the crowd not with fear, but with a solemn kind of pity. "You bury me," she said, "but you will still dig graves." The words cut through the night, and for a moment even the angriest hesitated, uneasy with the conviction in her tone. But the hesitation broke beneath the weight of loss and rage. The rope was pulled. The town's hunger for closure met its terrible feast in that instant. Healer against executioner, mercy against wrath. Corinth had chosen violence, and in doing so it sealed its story, not only in the soil of Mississippi, but in the conscience of all who stood beneath that tree. The confrontation was complete, not a trial, not an escape, but a communal judgment that no law could prevent. Eli would later say, in his broken recollections, that he heard silence after the act louder than any cry, the silence of a town that had crossed a line from which it could never return. The morning after the oak bore its grim burden, Corinth awoke to a silence that felt less like peace than exhaustion. The mob had dispersed in the night, leaving behind trampled earth, a coil of rope swaying gently in the dawn wind. and the hushed whispers of those who had stood witness. No bells tolled, no hymns were sung. The town moved as if under a pall, each step carrying the weight of an act that could not be unwound. Sheriff Eli Carter, his face bruised and his spirit hollow, walked the square alone, eyes fixed on the courthouse flag that now seemed to hang not in honor but in shame. The official record of that day was scant. A single entry appeared in the county ledger. March 1875, one Martha Elkins, deceased. No cause listed, no trial mentioned. Only her name struck through in a clerk's hand. Yet the unofficial record, the journals hidden away, the broken jars of herbs, the whispered testimony of those who claimed to hear her final words, lingered far longer than ink. Some swore the brass key was buried with her. Others claimed it disappeared into a family chest, passed down as both warning and ward. The absence of certainty only deepened the mystery, allowing the tale to grow with each retelling. The aftermath revealed the starkest contrast of all, the relief of justice against the unease of guilt. Some families declared themselves unburdened, saying their homes felt lighter, their fields safer. Yet others began to notice that infant deaths did not cease with Martha's passing. The same coughs rattled in tiny lungs, the same fevers rose in the night, and coffins still measured far too small for the weight they bore. The healer was gone, but the graves remained. In time, this bitter truth whispered through Corinth like a draught under a locked door, unsettling those who had believed they had struck at the root of their sorrow. Artifacts of suppression emerged as well. Eli's logbook entries from that month were later found with pages torn out, as though someone had tried to erase his doubts about Martha's guilt. Church records showed baptisms and burials in neat succession, but certain names were missing, their fates omitted. The county courthouse sealed the journals taken from Martha's cabin, labeling them unfit for public review. Whether this was to spare the town shame or to bury uncomfortable truths is unknown. What can be said is that silence became the chosen refuge, as if forgetting could serve as absolution. For Eli Carter, there was no forgetting. His letters to a distant cousin, written in the autumn of that year, paint a man unraveling. In one he confessed, "I swore to uphold law, yet I bowed before fury. The rope did not only take her life, it took the measure of mine as well. He served out his term, but did not seek re-election. Some say he drank himself to ruin, others that he left Mississippi altogether, haunted by the image of a woman beneath an oak, speaking truths he could not silence." The philosophical weight of Martha's story lies in its questions more than its answers. Was she a murderer who cloaked her crimes in herbs and hymns, or a midwife condemned by the very tragedies she sought to heal? Was the key she carried truly to coffins, or was it a symbol of a burden no woman should have borne alone? The responsibility of life and death in a place with no doctors, no mercy, and no understanding? Corinth chose its answer in violence, but history refuses to settle so neatly. Viewers hearing this tale today must wrestle with the same unease the town carried. How often does fear masquerade as justice? How many times has a community buried not only a body but also the possibility of truth? And what does it mean that even after her death, the graves kept coming? Perhaps the story of Martha Elkins is less about one woman's guilt or innocence than about the hunger of grief-stricken people to find a figure to blame, a vessel for their pain. As you reflect on this account, consider what echoes still linger from such histories. Do we recognize when fear drives us to condemn, or do we disguise it as righteousness until it is too late? Let us end not with certainty, but with the question Martha herself left in the air: "You bury me, but you will still dig graves." If you have stayed with this story until now, I invite you to share your thoughts. Was Martha Elkins a healer betrayed by superstition, or did the town of Corinth finally confront a hidden killer? Leave your perspective below, and let us carry forward not just the memory of her fate, but the questions it demands of us. For in stories like these, history's shadow falls not only on the past, but also on how we judge in the present.